Hello, my friend. Or should I say, good evening, gentle soul, sitting there in the quiet glow of your room. Perhaps you have a cup of tea near you. Perhaps the shadows of the late hour are stretching across your walls. And perhaps your body is seeking rest, but your mind still wanders. Hi, guy. Yes, whether you stumbled here by chance or sought this space with intention, I welcome you. And if you feel that quiet tug between wakefulness and sleep, that is exactly where you are meant to be right now. Because tonight, we will drift together, backward through time, back into the kitchens and banquet halls of a queen who ruled not only a kingdom but also the hearts and imaginations of generations. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen of England. And though history remembers her as a monarch wrapped in velvet, pearls, and politics, tonight we will step into something softer, stranger, more human. We will wander into her cravings, her indulgences, her guilty delights, the junk food of Elizabeth I, and more. But before we cross the threshold of her age, let us pause here together. Let me ask you a simple question. What is it you reach for, late at night, when the hunger is small but persistent, when your body longs for comfort, not sustenance? A bag of chips, perhaps, or something sweet, sticky, and unwise. Imagine now that you are not in the 21st century, but in the 16th. Imagine that your choices are not wrapped in crinkling plastic, but in pewter platters, glazed trenchers, and dripping honeypots. Can you feel the shift? The quiet hum of the modern world recedes, and the rough wooden beams of an Elizabethan kitchen rise around you. The hearth glows, not with electricity, but with coal and oak embers, and the air is heavy with scents, roasted game, spiced pies, and sweetmeats, so rich with sugar they crunch between your teeth like glass. Elizabeth lived in an age where food was more than nourishment. It was performance, spectacle, and above all, identity. To eat in her court was to take part in theater, every dish a symbol of power, every bite a declaration of wealth. And yet, beneath the glittering banquets, there was something else. There were cravings, little indulgences, small and guilty, that slipped between ceremony and survival. The queen herself, though often portrayed as aloof, carried a fondness for the sweet, the candied, the frivolous, and her people, nobles, courtiers, and commoners alike, sought out the medieval ancestors of what we now call junk food, fried tidbits, sugar, soaked almonds, pies crusted with lard, and street corner treats greasy in the hand. Do you feel it now? That blend of intimacy and distance, as if you are peering into another world while still resting safely in your own. That is where we will stay tonight. We will not rush. There is no need. The night is long, and the story stretches wide, like a tapestry woven with golden thread. I want you to imagine yourself seated at a long oak table, the wood scarred with centuries of knives, your fingers tracing the grooves as the voices of the past murmur around you. Elizabeth's England is alive again, not in the pages of a dusty book, but in the rhythm of our quiet telling. Think of her childhood first, for every craving begins there. Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, grew up in a world where food was both danger and delight. The kitchens of her father's court were immense, filled with the smoke of roasting meats and the perfume of spices imported from lands distant and unknown. But for a child, the most vivid memories might not be the grand roasts of swan or the elaborate subtleties shaped like castles. They might be the sticky fingers from candied violets, the sudden thrill of biting into something forbidden, something small enough to be hidden, but sweet enough to be remembered. Imagine her, not as the painted queen in ruff and gown, but as a girl with quick eyes, slipping a sugared date into her mouth when the attendants turned away. That flicker of indulgence, that spark of junk food delight, never truly left her. And when she became queen, when the crown pressed upon her head and the weight of the kingdom bent her shoulders, those small indulgences took on new meaning. They were no longer childish thefts but private sanctuaries, moments of escape from the endless theater of rule. Sugar was her great weakness, and in the Elizabethan world, sugar was both medicine and poison. It was precious, expensive, carried from far coasts by merchants who risked their lives for its crystalline cargo. To eat it was to proclaim wealth, to display power, to sparkle with sweetness in a world that was still, in many ways, coarse. And yet sugar rotted teeth, blackened gums, and left smiles edged with decay. Elizabeth herself, in her later years, bore the proof of her sweet tooth. Behind the pearls of her portraits lay teeth darkened by indulgence, and perhaps, when she smiled, courtiers saw the price of pleasure written plainly. But that, too, is the truth of junk food. It comforts, it delights, it destroys, all in the same slow bite. Let us pause again. Can you feel the paradox? That what consoles us may also corrode us? That the late-night snack, whether in your hand now or in Elizabeth's, is never entirely innocent? The human heart has always danced with temptation, and the kitchen has always been its ballroom. Elizabeth's banquets glittered with grandeur, but her small cravings whispered the same secrets that echo in us today. Hunger, comfort, desire, surrender. As we drift deeper into her world, you will hear the footsteps of courtiers echoing across flagstones, the scrape of knives on pewter plates, the hiss of dripping fat in pans. You will taste the sweetness of marchpane almond paste sculpted into shapes and glazed with rosewater. You will see the street sellers, outside the palace walls, hawking hot pies and roasted chestnuts to those who could not dream of dining with a queen. The court and the street, the crown and the commoner, all bound together by food both sacred and sinful, noble and junk alike. Do not hurry to understand all of this now. Let it come slowly, like the drifting of a candle flame. Tonight's journey is not one of speed, but of depth. We will move gently, from hall to hall, from kitchen to chamber, from feast to famine, tracing the shadowed edges of Elizabeth's appetite. Along the way, you may find yourself thinking of your own habits, your own indulgences, the little foods that call to you when reason has gone quiet. That is the charm of history. It mirrors us, even when it wears a ruff and crown. And so, welcome again, my friend. Whether you are still fully awake or already half asleep, let your mind wander with me into the scented air of Elizabeth's England. This will be our shared dream tonight, not the battles and treaties of her reign, not the politics or the suitors, but the crumbs and confections, the indulgences that reveal her humanity, the junk food of a queen, and more. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a palace corridor, the stones beneath your feet cool and silent, the air tinged with faint smoke from distant hearths. Beyond those carved oak doors lies the childhood of Elizabeth Tudor, a childhood that carried in its folds not only the sharp edge of danger and survival, but also the softer, quieter texture of food, the kinds of flavors and sensations that children, even royal children, cling to when the world feels uncertain. You may think of Elizabeth as a queen adorned with lace and pearls, but before she was sovereign, she was a girl watching the kitchens of Hampton Court bustle with noise, smelling the roasting meats drifting through the air, listening to the steady chop of knives on wooden blocks. The rhythm of those kitchens was like a second heartbeat to the palace itself, relentless, ceaseless, feeding not just bodies but symbols. For food in the Tudor world was politics disguised as nourishment, and for Elizabeth, every bite was already marked with meaning. Picture her small hand reaching toward a trencher, a slab of stale bread used as a plate, catching the juices of meats, soaking in the spice-laden gravies until it softened and became a treat in its own right. This was no refined confection, no elegant marchpane shaped into roses, but something more humble, more akin to what we might call junk food now. The soaked bread, salty, greasy, indulgent, often devoured quickly before it cooled. Imagine her, young, curious, tasting the richness absorbed by the bread, a moment of quiet delight amidst the swirl of court life. It was in moments like these that indulgence began to form her relationship with food, one that balanced necessity with craving, ritual with secrecy. You might think of junk food as something modern, something born of factories and machines, but its essence is much older. Junk food is not just about artificial wrappers. It is about immediacy, about the collision of pleasure and guilt, about the taste that lingers longer than it ought to. For Elizabeth, the candied fruits imported from Spain or Italy, crystallized in sugar that sparkled like jewels, were her guilty delights. They were treasures disguised as snacks, small enough to slip past attendants, potent enough to leave her wanting more. She learned early that power and indulgence were bound together, that the sweetest things were also the most dangerous. Politically, physically, even spiritually, her father's court was a dangerous feast, both literally and figuratively. Imagine Henry VIII presiding at table, surrounded by mountains of food-roasted boars, steaming pies, gilded marchpanes, sculpted into fantastical castles, all symbols of his insatiable hunger for both food and dominance. Elizabeth, a child in the shadow of that appetite, learned that food was never just food. It was excess, it was theater, and yet in the corners of that theater, there were smaller indulgences, things less scripted, more intimate. Servants would sneak tidbits, scraps of pastry, spiced nuts, sugared almonds, left after banquets. Elizabeth's young tongue carried those flavors, and even when her life was threatened, when she lived half in exile, half in suspicion, the memory of candied sweetness followed her like a soft ghost, a whisper of comfort in a world sharpened by fear. There is something profoundly human about the foods we crave when the world feels unstable. For some, it is the crisp bite of something fried. For others, the melting of sugar on the tongue. For Elizabeth, her cravings grew in tandem with her fears. As she grew older, as she watched the fates of her stepmothers twist into tragedy, as she learned to speak cautiously and trust sparingly, food became both a weapon and a refuge. The rich banquets of her youth were not always accessible to her, especially when she lived away from the heart of power. But there were always indulgences to be found, always small comforts. A pie bought hot from a street vendor, its crust greasy with lard, its filling peppered and pungent. Roasted chestnuts sold in handfuls to warm cold fingers on winter nights. Wafers crisp and light, made from flour and honey, that snapped between the teeth with delicate finality. These were the Elizabethan echoes of the modern candy bar, the late-night snack, the fast food indulgence. They were not grand, but they were enough. And as Elizabeth matured, as she became the young woman who would one day carry the crown, her taste for these indulgences did not vanish, it deepened. When she entered the court of her sister Mary, she understood that everything she ate was observed, everything she enjoyed whispered about. To be seen indulging too much was to risk the charge of excess. To be seen abstaining was to appear aloof, ungrateful. It was a tightrope, and Elizabeth walked it with the same precision she brought to politics. Yet behind the closed doors of her chambers, when the candles flickered low, she could allow herself small rebellions. A sugared marchpane figurine popped into her mouth without ceremony. A candied date, sticky between her fingers. A slice of pie, eaten not with a golden fork but with bare hands. These moments, fleeting though they were, sustained her in ways beyond nutrition. They reminded her that she was human, that queens are made of flesh and craving, not only duty. The Tudor kitchen itself was an empire of sensation. If you lean closer, you can almost smell it now. The heaviness of roasting meat mingled with the sharpness of vinegar, the sweetness of honey, the earthiness of ale brewed in great barrels, the clatter of pans, the barks of cooks, the laughter of scullery maids scrubbing at stubborn stains, all blending into a symphony of survival and display. For Elizabeth, this was the background hum of her childhood and her young adulthood, and every note of it lodged itself within her. She knew the spectacle of food served upon silver, but she also knew the greasy pleasures that slipped through ceremony's cracks. Junk food was not a label she would have recognized, but indulgence? That she knew intimately. Even when she became queen, when she sat at the center of power and ritual, she never truly abandoned the small cravings of her youth. Sugar, in particular, clung to her like a shadow. In an age when sugar was medicine, status, and luxury, Elizabeth consumed it as though it were a quiet rebellion against the strictures of her role. Candied fruit, marchpane, gingerbread glazed in gilt, spiced wine sweetened until it was almost syrup, these were her delights. They soothed her nerves, they brightened her mood, they carried her back, perhaps, to those childhood moments of stolen pleasure. But they also marked her body, left their traces in her smile, etched the price of indulgence into her very teeth. The Virgin Queen, so often painted as eternal and untouchable, bore the human evidence of craving written in the blackened enamel of her later years. And yet, do not think of this as decay alone. Think of it instead as the story of craving carried through a lifetime, a thread of sweetness weaving itself through the fabric of power. Imagine her, in the silence after a council meeting, taking a candied violet between her lips, the taste delicate and perfumed, a moment of softness before returning to the hard edge of politics. Imagine her, after a progress through muddy villages and cheering crowds, sipping on spiced wine, thick with sugar, a warmth blooming in her chest even as her mind calculated alliances. Food was always present, always shaping, always reflecting the balance between indulgence and survival. Perhaps you have felt something similar. Perhaps you, too, have turned to small comforts in difficult times: a bar of chocolate before an exam, a slice of cake after heartbreak, a handful of salty crisps when words failed you. Elizabeth's world may feel distant, but in this, she was close to us. Her junk food was different in form, but not in spirit. It was her way of finding the human within the queen, the private within the public. And when she reached for sweetness, when she allowed herself indulgence, she revealed the quiet truth that history often hides. Rulers are bound by craving, just as we are, their power never quite enough to still the hunger that grows in the quiet spaces of the night. So let us linger here, in the first stage of her life, in the kitchens of her childhood and the chambers of her youth, where indulgence first taught her its double-edged lessons. Here, in the mingling of sweet and salt, grease and sugar, we begin to understand the queen not only as monarch but as human, bound by the same whispers of appetite that haunt us all. From this foundation, the story will grow, stretching into her reign, into the grandeur and secrecy of her cravings. But for now, let the image rest with you. Elizabeth, young, sharp-eyed, tasting sweetness with a mixture of delight and suspicion, already learning that what pleases the tongue may also carry a price. And so the tale of her junk food, her indulgence, her humanity unfolds, slow and steady, like the turning of a great wheel in the quiet night. When the crown finally touched Elizabeth's head, the world seemed to expand around her, and yet the space she could truly call her own grew smaller and smaller. Imagine her standing beneath the weight of coronation robes, the fur pressing against her shoulders, the jewels glittering in torchlight, and beneath it all, her body still the same body that remembered sugared violets stolen in childhood, greasy crusts eaten quickly before a servant's glance could catch her. Becoming queen did not erase those hungers, it only disguised them beneath layers of ceremony. And so, as Elizabeth settled into her reign, the banquets of her court became both armor and indulgence, both shield and stage. The early years of her queenship were marked by uncertainty. She was watched not only by her own counselors, but by Europe itself. Every ambassador scrutinizing her gestures, every rival monarch testing her strength. And food, always food, became one of the ways she communicated. When foreign dignitaries sat at her table, they were not simply fed, they were impressed, overwhelmed, dazzled by the richness of the feast. Golden marchpane towers rose above the tables. Pies baked with spices from across the seas steamed before them. Wines sweetened with mountains of sugar glittered like liquid jewels. It was theater, and Elizabeth was both director and star. But behind that spectacle, behind the shimmering surface, there remained the private side of appetite, the junk food moments that spoke not of politics, but of craving. Picture her slipping away from the great hall after a banquet, her attendants fussing, her courtiers whispering, and within the safety of her chambers, a smaller table set with things less ceremonial, more personal. Candied ginger to soothe her stomach, wafers crisp and light to cleanse her palate, perhaps a plate of marchpane bites dusted with sugar. These were not the towering displays meant to awe ambassadors. They were the quiet indulgences that carried her through the exhaustion of rule. In those first years as queen, when she needed to project strength yet longed for comfort, it was in these sugared treats and spiced sips that she found balance. The kitchens of her court were kingdoms of their own, bustling with activity from dawn until midnight. Fires roared, pots clattered, the smell of roasting meat filled the air until it clung to every garment. And yet, within that chaos, there was always someone assigned to the smaller, subtler work, the creation of sweetmeats, wafers, comfits. Almonds rolled in sugar until they gleamed like pearls, orange peels candied until their bitterness transformed into sweetness, ginger baked into soft, warm breads. These were Elizabeth's small pleasures, and though they bore the trappings of refinement, they carried the same spirit that modern eyes would recognize in candy bars or pastries grabbed from a street corner. Quick, indulgent, comforting junk food disguised in royal splendor. Elizabeth's court was also a place of tension, a theater where loyalty was constantly tested, and in such an environment, indulgence carried meaning. To share a treat with her, to be offered a sugared comfit or a sip of spiced wine, was to be included in her circle, however briefly. These small foods became tokens of favor, edible symbols of intimacy and trust. Imagine the hush of a private audience, the queen in her chair, a tray of candied fruits before her, and the subtle offering of one piece to a favored courtier. It was not just sugar, it was politics, wrapped in sweetness. And yet, for Elizabeth herself, it was also indulgence, a chance to savor the fleeting comfort of taste, while navigating a world where every word, every gesture, could change the course of history. The paradox of her reign was that indulgence was both a necessity and a danger. Sugar was treasured, imported at great cost, displayed proudly as a sign of wealth. But Elizabeth's fondness for it was whispered about, noted by observers who remarked on the queen's teeth, the decay hidden behind her painted smile. Even in her youth as queen, she understood the price of sweetness, and yet she returned to it again and again, as if the momentary comfort outweighed the long-term consequence. That is the nature of junk food, is it not? To know it is unwise and to reach for it regardless, to surrender to the fleeting joy of flavor, even while acknowledging the quiet harm it brings. Elizabeth embodied this paradox, and in doing so, she revealed a profoundly human truth, that power cannot shield us from craving, that crowns do not silence hunger. Beyond the palace walls, the people of her England also indulged in their own versions of junk food. Vendors sold hot pies on the streets of London, their crusts golden, their fillings rich with spiced meat or sweet fruit. Roasted chestnuts warmed cold hands in winter, fritters sizzled in hot oil, their scent drifting through alleys. Children clutched sugar sticks, bright and brittle, while adults bit into gingerbread, molded into shapes of kings and queens. Elizabeth's indulgences were mirrored in the world beyond her court, a reminder that junk food belongs not to one class or another, but to the shared human desire for quick pleasure. When the queen savored candied fruit, and when a child on London Bridge licked honey from sticky fingers, they were connected, across the gulf of rank, by the same craving. And yet, within the palace, indulgence carried heavier meaning. Food was a weapon as much as a comfort. Poison was a constant fear, and the very sweetness Elizabeth loved could be a vessel for danger. Every sugared almond, every candied violet, had to pass through trusted hands, and still, suspicion lingered. To indulge was to risk, and yet she indulged anyway. Imagine her, lifting a sweetmeat to her lips, knowing the possibility of betrayal, and choosing to taste it regardless. In that act lay not only hunger but defiance, the refusal to let fear dictate every choice. Even in indulgence, Elizabeth was performing her strength. Her reign's early years were filled with suitors, foreign princes, and local lords, each hoping to win her hand. Banquets were staged as displays of wealth, dishes chosen as much for symbolism as for taste. A pie filled with live birds might burst forth in spectacle. Roasted peacocks might be dressed again in their feathers, gilded and gleaming. But beneath the grandeur, Elizabeth's own cravings remained simpler. When the halls emptied and the candles burned low, it was not the grand roasts she sought, but the sweets, the wafers, the candied fruits that had comforted her since youth. That private indulgence, that return to sweetness, became a pattern that carried her through decades. Imagine yourself now at her table, not the grand feast with trumpets and banners, but the smaller, quieter one. The room is dim, the queen seated in a gown loosened after hours of ceremony, her attendants fewer, the mood softer. Before her lies a plate of marchpane, sculpted into flowers, delicate and glistening. She picks one up, bites into it, the almond paste yielding beneath the crunch of sugar. For a moment, the weight of rule eases. For a moment, she is not the virgin queen, not the master of state, but simply a woman tasting sweetness in the dark. That image, tender and human, tells us more about her than any portrait. It is in these indulgences, these junk food cravings, that we glimpse the heart of Elizabeth, beating beneath the armor of history. And so, as her reign began, indulgence became both her comfort and her language. Sugar spoke where words could not. Sweetness soothed where politics could not. Junk food, in its Elizabethan form, was not trivial. It was essential. a thread woven through her survival and her performance alike. As the years passed, as her power grew, these cravings did not vanish but deepened, shaping not only her body but her court, her politics, her image. To understand Elizabeth, we must taste what she tasted. We must linger in the quiet after banquets. We must see her not only as queen but as human, craving sweetness even when she knew its cost. There came a time when Elizabeth no longer stood at the uncertain threshold of her reign, but instead strode firmly within it, her presence unmistakable, her image crafted into an almost mythical vision of power. The Virgin Queen, painted in shimmering gowns, jeweled with pearls that suggested chastity and eternity, stood as both monarch and symbol, and around her, the court moved in orbit, each courtier vying for favor, each ambassador searching for meaning in her smallest gestures. Yet beneath that glittering theater, beneath the ruffs and silks, there still lay the quieter hum of appetite, the rhythm of indulgence that whispered through her life. To understand Elizabeth in her fullness is to look not only at her speeches and her portraits, but at her table, and the way it mirrored both the excesses and the vulnerabilities of her reign. In the height of her power, her banquets became legends of spectacle. Imagine the hall filled with torchlight, shadows trembling on painted walls, music echoing in vaulted ceilings, and tables spread with food so abundant it seemed a kingdom had been placed upon oak boards. Here were pies whose crusts concealed entire flocks of game birds, their wings bursting forth when the knife broke through. Here were roasted stags, antlers readorned with gold leaf, flesh glistening beneath spiced sauces. Here were subtleties, those edible sculptures crafted of marchpane and sugar, shaped into crowns, castles, even scenes from mythology. Every dish spoke of mastery, not only over kitchen fires but over the world itself. To host such a feast was to declare, England is prosperous, England is powerful, England is ruled by a queen whose table lacks nothing. And yet, while ambassadors marveled and courtiers applauded, Elizabeth herself often took little from these displays beyond the smallest bites. For her indulgences, her cravings, were not in the towering spectacles but in the smaller, sweeter things that came after the wafers, the comfits, the candied fruits that lingered on plates when the grand roasts were carried away. Consider the marchpane, almond paste kneaded with sugar, pressed into molds, baked until firm, then painted with gold or glazed with rosewater. At great feasts, marchpane towers rose high, symbols of wealth and refinement. But Elizabeth's fondness was for the smaller pieces, the ones she could taste privately. There was something about the way the sweetness softened on the tongue, the almond blending with sugar until the distinction disappeared, that seemed to draw her again and again. Foreign visitors remarked on it, this queen with a sweet tooth so pronounced it left its marks upon her smile. They did not always speak kindly, but their words revealed something more intimate, that even in the height of her power, Elizabeth was not untouched by craving. In fact, her cravings seemed only to intensify, as if the pressure of rule demanded greater comforts, and sugar, costly and coveted, became her chosen solace. The court followed her example, of course. What the queen ate, the courtiers imitated. Soon, comfit small seeds or nuts, coated again and again with sugar, until they became gleaming pearls of sweetness, were passed from hand to hand, sucked during conversations, offered as tokens of affection. Gingerbread molded into the likeness of Elizabeth herself became popular at fairs, its sharp spices softened by honey, its surface sometimes gilded to honor her. Children bit into those gingerbread queens with delight, and in doing so, consumed not just food but propaganda, their mouths filled with a symbol of loyalty disguised as treat. The line between indulgence and politics blurred, and Elizabeth stood at the center of it, her fondness for sugar shaping not only her body but her kingdom's culture. Yet indulgence always carried shadows. Sugar, though celebrated, was not innocent. Physicians warned of its effects, though their understanding was limited. They spoke of humors unbalanced, of teeth weakened, of the body made sluggish by too much sweetness. And Elizabeth's own smile, in her later portraits carefully concealed, bore the truth of those warnings. The blackened teeth, the gums inflamed, were whispered about at court. But still, she reached for sweetness. Perhaps you know that paradox yourself, the knowledge that what comforts you also harms you, and yet the comfort calls too strongly to resist. For Elizabeth, whose days were filled with council debates, ambassadorial games, threats of invasion, whispers of treachery. Perhaps that small indulgence was worth any consequence. A sugared violet melting on her tongue may have felt, in that moment, like a reprieve from the endless demands of sovereignty. And while she indulged, her people did the same, though their versions were humbler. On the streets of London, vendors hawked roasted chestnuts, hot pies, fritters sizzling in oil, the scent of them clinging to the damp air. Children licked sugar sticks until their faces were sticky. Laborers gnawed on pasties filled with meat scraps. These were the junk foods of the age, consumed not with ceremony but with haste, eaten with fingers, greasy and sweet. Elizabeth's indulgences mirrored theirs, though gilded in refinement. The Queen's candied fruits and the commoner's fried fritter were kin, born of the same human hunger for quick pleasure, for the bite that satisfies more than it nourishes. And in this, queen and subject were bound, their cravings alike beneath the gulf of rank. Yet, for Elizabeth, indulgence was never entirely private. Every act was observed, every preference noted, every habit repeated, until it became part of her myth. Courtiers whispered about her sweet tooth, ambassadors reported it to their kings, playwrights hinted at it in verse. To love sugar was to reveal vulnerability, and in the sharp-edged world of politics, vulnerability was dangerous. But Elizabeth wielded even this as a weapon. By allowing her fondness for sweetness to be known, she softened her image, turned herself from untouchable monarch into human woman. It was a calculated indulgence, as much a performance as her speeches or her portraits. The virgin queen who refused marriage, who declared herself wedded to her people, also revealed, in her craving for candied violets and marchpane roses, that she was flesh and blood, that she too sought comfort, that she too surrendered to small pleasures. And in that surrender, paradoxically, she grew stronger, for she became relatable, beloved, more than myth. Imagine the scene. The queen in her private chamber, the day's burdens heavy upon her, counselors dismissed, candles guttering low. Before her sits a dish of candied fruit, perhaps oranges, imported at great cost, their rinds sugared until they glisten. She lifts one piece, studies it in the candlelight, then places it on her tongue. The sweetness blooms, the bitterness of the rind softened into something fragrant and delicate. For that moment, the wars with Spain, the unrest in Ireland, the endless dance of marriage proposals fade. For that moment, there is only sweetness, only indulgence. And then the moment passes, and the queen is queen again. But it is in that fleeting space, that small surrender, that we glimpse her humanity most clearly. In the height of her reign, Elizabeth balanced constantly between the grandeur of public feasts and the intimacy of private cravings. The junk food of her age, sweets, comfits, candied fruits, pastries became her companions, her comforts, her symbols. And as the years rolled on, as victories were won and enemies vanquished, as her body aged and her image hardened into legend, that thread of indulgence continued, binding her youth to her maturity, her private self to her public myth. To follow it is to walk beside her, to understand not only her reign but her humanity, to see that even the greatest queen found solace in the smallest of pleasures, the ones that melted on the tongue and lingered long after the taste had faded. As the years gathered like shadows at the edge of her reign, Elizabeth carried herself with the same brilliance, the same carefully constructed radiance that had dazzled ambassadors in her youth. The portraits painted her eternal, white face gleaming with powder, crimson lips curved with command, eyes sharp with intelligence that refused to dim. And yet behind that painted armor, the human body whispered its truths. Time marked her in ways that no pigment could disguise, and one of those whispers was written in her smile, or rather, in what had slowly been taken from it. The sugar that had comforted her, the candied violets, the marchpane roses, the gilded gingerbread, had left their trace not only in memory but in flesh. Her teeth, once strong, had darkened, loosened, receded, until her mouth bore the quiet ruin of indulgence. And still, she could not, would not abandon the sweetness. There is something deeply human in that paradox, is there not? To know that what you crave has already wounded you, and yet to reach for it again. Elizabeth, sovereign of a kingdom that stretched across seas, could command armies, could dictate policy, could bend courtiers to her will, but she could not quiet the call of sugar. In that small defiance, she was no different from us, caught between reason and longing, between discipline and comfort. And perhaps that is why her later years shimmer with a strange intimacy. The Virgin Queen, painted untouchable, was yet undone by something as ordinary, as universal, as a sweet tooth. Imagine her now in her later chamber, older, more fragile, yet still unwilling to yield the performance of majesty. The candles burn low, her ladies fuss with her gowns, her counselors await outside with the burdens of the state. On a nearby table, a dish of candied fruits glistens, the sugared surface catching the light. She lifts one to her lips, her hand trembling only slightly, and tastes the same sweetness she has known since childhood. It does not matter that her teeth ache, that decay has crept into her mouth. For that moment, she is soothed, transported, sustained by the same indulgence that has always walked beside her. Junk food, if we dare to call it so, becomes, in this chamber, not trivial but essential, a thread binding her to her past, a comfort against the relentless march of age. The court still performed its feasts, still staged its spectacles. But by now, Elizabeth was more than the central figure, she was the myth around which they revolved. And yet, even myths have cravings. While ambassadors marveled at subtleties shaped like ships or fortresses, while courtiers whispered about favors and rivalries, Elizabeth's private indulgences remained the same. The comfits, the wafers, the candied fruits followed her through the decades, loyal companions in a life where loyalty was rare. And the more her body bore the evidence of indulgence, the more her image leaned into artifice. The face powdered white to mask age, the lips painted to suggest youth, the smile controlled so as not to betray what lay behind. Food had always been theater, but now the theater expanded to encompass the body itself. Do you sense it, the tension between image and reality, between what is shown and what is hidden? Elizabeth lived in that tension daily, and her indulgences reflected it. Sugar, once a symbol of youth and prosperity, became in her later years both a mask and a revelation. To taste sweetness was to recall triumphs long past, to anchor herself in a world that had changed around her. But it was also to carry the scars of craving, scars that could not be painted away. And so her indulgence became an act of resilience, a quiet insistence on humanity beneath the weight of symbolism. Her people, too, saw the contradictions. They adored her, they mythologized her, they whispered about her blackened teeth, even as they celebrated her victories. On the streets of London, gingerbread queens continued to be sold, their spiced bodies devoured by children who perhaps did not know that the real queen's smile no longer matched the gilded image they consumed. It was junk food turned into propaganda, indulgence turned into loyalty, and Elizabeth herself became both subject and object of that strange transformation. To eat sweetness in her likeness was to honor her, and yet the truth of her own body told a darker tale. Still, she did not relinquish control. Elizabeth was never passive in her myth-making. If sugar marred her teeth, then powder would mask her skin. If indulgence betrayed her humanity, then performance would elevate it into legend. She did not apologize for craving. She simply turned it into part of her story. In that way, junk food, her small, guilty pleasures, became both a weakness and a strength, a private indulgence and a public weapon. For if she could be seen enjoying sweetness, even in age, then she could be seen as enduring, unbroken, still capable of delight in a world that often demanded only austerity. There is a softness in imagining her this way. Not the hard queen delivering speeches, not the eternal virgin draped in pearls, but the aging woman, weary yet unyielding, finding solace in the same foods that had comforted her for decades. The marchpane, the comfits, the candied fruit, they were not trivial to her. They were anchors, memories, perhaps even companions in solitude. For Elizabeth, who had chosen to remain unmarried, who had bound herself not to one man but to an entire kingdom, solitude was constant. And in solitude, indulgence becomes more than pleasure. It becomes a form of intimacy, a way of soothing the self when no other arms are there. Her junk food was her secret partner, her nightly whisper, her soft rebellion against loneliness. And yet, even here, shadows intruded. Physicians noted her health, Courtiers remarked on her fading vitality. Ambassadors speculated about her strength. Every indulgence carried consequence, and the marks of sugar on her body were read as signs of decline. But Elizabeth did not let decline define her. She turned indulgence into endurance, sweetness into defiance. Even as her teeth darkened, even as her body aged, she held fast to the rituals that comforted her, and in doing so, she revealed something timeless. That the power of food is not in its nourishment alone, but in its ability to remind us we are alive, that we can still taste, still desire, still crave. So in her later years, the junk food of Elizabeth I, those candied treats, those sugared indulgences, became not just pleasures but symbols of her resilience, her humanity, her refusal to surrender even the smallest comforts to the passage of time. And if her smile no longer gleamed, if whispers circled about the price she paid, then so be it. She remained queen, she remained myth, and her cravings remained her own. To see her this way is to see the paradox of power and humanity entwined. The Virgin Queen, untouchable in history, yet forever touched by the sweetness she could not resist. By the middle of her reign, Elizabeth had become not merely a ruler but a living emblem, a breathing tapestry stitched together with symbols of power, chastity, and endurance. Yet even as her body bore the costs of craving, her kingdom absorbed and expanded upon those very indulgences, until the junk food of her age was no longer just food but language spoken in kitchens, whispered in streets, enacted in festivals and fairs. It is here, in the cultural mirror of her people, that her indulgences took on a life of their own, shaping not only her image but the texture of England itself. Step into a London street of the 1,570 seconds, and you will feel it. The air is damp with river mist, but layered upon it are scents that belong to appetite. The sweet smoke of chestnuts roasting in iron pans, the yeasty warmth of pies baked fresh and hawked to passers-by, the sharp crackle of fritters frying in oil, their edges bubbling, their centers soft. Vendors shout their wares, children dart between skirts and boots, coins clink as food changes hands. This is not the solemn grandeur of the Queen's feasts. This is the pulse of the city, the hunger of laborers, apprentices, and merchants, satisfied not by roasts on silver platters, but by handheld indulgences, eaten hot, eaten fast, eaten without thought for tomorrow. It is junk food, in its purest sense. Immediate, comforting, disposable, and yet, even here, the Queen's shadow looms. Gingerbread, molded into her likeness, is sold in stalls, spiced and sweet, sometimes painted with gilt, so that children quite literally consume her image. Imagine biting into the Virgin Queen, her face reduced to a sugared caricature, her authority softened into sweetness. Was it loyalty? Was it satire? Was it both? The answer hardly matters, for the act itself wove her deeper into daily life. Elizabeth was not only the sovereign seen on coinage or in paintings. She was eaten, tasted, devoured in gingerbread and sugar effigies, her myth absorbed into the stomachs of her subjects. The junk food of her age became propaganda, edible loyalty disguised as treat, yet also a way for the commoner to claim intimacy with the unreachable figure of their queen. In the playhouses of London, too, indulgence carried its meanings. Crowds gathered to watch Shakespeare's words unfold, to laugh, to weep, to marvel, but always with food in hand. Oranges sliced into quarters, their juices sticky on fingers, nuts cracked and shells scattered across wooden floors, pies stuffed with spiced meat, eaten while actors declaimed. The theater itself became scented with grease and sweetness, the language of the stage mingling with the language of appetite. And in that mingling, the reign of Elizabeth was celebrated not only through verse but through the flavors her people loved. The Virgin Queen might never set foot in those playhouses herself, but her image hovered, invoked in plays, mirrored in allegories. Her fondness for indulgence whispered of even there. To snack in the playhouse was not so far from her nibbling on candied fruits in her chamber. Both were acts of distraction, of comfort, of surrender to craving. The entire culture, from palace to pit, was bound together by indulgence, and as sugar poured into England from distant colonies, as merchants grew rich on the trade, indulgence expanded. What had once been rare became more common, though still marked by status. The queen's fondness for sweets trickled down, shaping taste, encouraging imitation. Recipes for marchpane spread. Fritters were flavored with spices once reserved for nobles. Comfits found their way into wealthier homes. Junk food was democratizing. In its way, what began as royal indulgence became aspiration, then became habit. To eat sweet was to imitate the queen, to touch, however lightly, her world. But indulgence is never free of consequence. Physicians warned of the dangers of too much sugar, of humors unbalanced, of bodies weakened. Pamphlets scolded those who gorged on fritters and pies, accusing them of sloth and sin. The church itself sometimes condemned indulgence, equating gluttony with moral failure. Yet the people continued, and so did their queen. There is a kind of stubbornness in craving, a refusal to bow to admonition. And in this, Elizabeth and her subjects shared a bond deeper than loyalty. They shared the defiance of appetite. They reached for sweetness, for grease, for comfort, even when reason or authority advised restraint. The symbolism grew heavier as her reign lengthened. Elizabeth, painted with a face smooth as porcelain though years pressed hard upon her, was like a sugared fruit herself, preserved, gilded, yet slowly decaying beneath the surface. The marchpane roses she loved mirrored her own myth, beautiful, delicate, but artificial, crafted from paste and sugar rather than grown from soil. Junk food became metaphor, indulgence became allegory, and in that allegory, the truth of her reign was written. England itself was indulging, expanding, consuming, sweetening its tongue even as its teeth rotted, even as its colonies bled to supply its cravings. The queen's sweet tooth was not merely personal, it was national, cultural, imperial. Imagine again her court, not in its early vigor but in its seasoned confidence. Courtiers, dressed in silks, cluster around tables heavy with food. They speak of politics, of marriage alliances, of trade routes, but their hands reach for comfits, for wafers, for sugared fruit. The very gestures of indulgence have become habits of power. To snack in the presence of the queen is to mirror her, to share in her craving, to affirm loyalty not through words but through appetite. The junk food of her reign thus became ritual, binding her court together in sweetness even as rivalries simmered beneath. And outside, in the markets, the indulgence of the people continued. Fried fish crackled in pans, pies steamed in the cold air, sellers shouted their wares, children with sticky hands licked sugar sticks, laborers devoured pastries, apprentices crunched nuts as they laughed. This was England alive, England indulging, England mirroring its queen in craving. Junk food was no longer merely food, it was identity, culture, theater. It spoke of prosperity, of power, of defiance, of humanity. For Elizabeth, watching all this, there must have been a strange satisfaction. Her image, her tastes, her cravings had become the cravings of her people. She was not simply ruling them, she was mirrored in them, consumed by them, transformed into sugar and spice, grease and sweetness. And though her body bore the marks of indulgence, her reign bore the strength of it. She had turned craving into culture, indulgence into language, junk food into myth. And so, in the heart of her reign, junk food was no longer just the private indulgence of a queen or the quick comfort of a commoner. It was the shared appetite of a nation, the taste that bound monarch and subject, palace and street, theater and kitchen. It was the sweetness that lingered on the tongue, long after the feast was done, long after the candles guttered out, long after the queen herself would be gone. By the time Elizabeth's reign had stretched into its later decades, the sweetness that once felt like a small rebellion had become something far weightier, almost sacramental in its presence. The queen, who had first reached for candied violets as a girl, now sat upon a throne shaped by decades of war, intrigue, and faith fractured beyond repair. Her cravings were no longer innocent, they were layered with meaning, their indulgence carrying not only the comfort of memory but the symbolism of survival. Each sugared almond, each comfit, each gilded wafer was swallowed with the knowledge that kingdoms rose and fell around her. And yet her appetite, quiet and unbroken, still remained. The world beyond her palace was thick with tension. Catholic Spain lurked like a shadow across the sea. the Armada defeated but never forgotten, its ghost haunting every policy. Puritans within England pressed for stricter lives, leaner appetites, the denial of indulgence in the name of piety. And between these forces stood Elizabeth, poised as always, her very body a battlefield of contradictions. To eat sweets in such a climate was to make a statement. It was defiance against austerity, an insistence that even in an age of sermons against gluttony, even in the shadow of war and death, the Queen of England would not yield her craving. The act of tasting became a ritual of sovereignty, her lips defying not only time, but the very voices of morality that sought to curb desire. Picture her court in these years-aged faces beside young ones, courtiers who had risen with her now gray-haired, their places soon to be taken by those who had never known a time without Elizabeth upon the throne. And yet the rituals remained the same. Feasts were staged, subtleties sculpted, sweets laid upon golden dishes. But if you leaned closer, you would see something different in the Queen's gaze. The eyes that once sparkled with youthful delight now carried shadows, and when she reached for her candied fruits, it was not only for taste but for solace, not only for sweetness but for something to soften the weight of solitude. For she was, after all, still the Virgin Queen, alone by choice, bound to her people but not to a companion. Her indulgences became her confidants, silent, loyal, ever ready to soothe. And in those same halls, religion hovered. Clerics thundered against the dangers of indulgence, linking sweetness with sin, gluttony with damnation. To overindulge was to fall into the grasp of vice. Yet Elizabeth, astute as ever, knew how to bend even this to her image. She was not a glutton. She was measured, controlled, her indulgences carefully veiled within the grandeur of ritual. To taste sugar in her chamber was not sin but sovereignty, not weakness but power. She transformed indulgence into iconography, the way she transformed her body into symbol. Just as her white-painted face became eternal youth, so her sweet tooth became a sign not of decay, but of prosperity, a reflection of England's wealth, its reach across seas, its mastery of trade. She allowed the whispers of her fondness, even the cruel comments on her teeth, to circle because they added to her myth. The Queen so wealthy, so enduring, that she could consume the very luxury that others only dreamed of. Yet mortality pressed closer. She had watched courtiers she loved grow old and die, suitors fade away, her own body betray her with aches and frailties. And still, she clung to her cravings. Think of it. A woman who could not escape the march of time, but who, in tasting sweetness, could at least momentarily hold it at bay. A candied peel of orange, sharp and fragrant, was more than food. It was memory of youth, memory of victory, memory of moments when the future stretched wide. To bite into sugar was to remind herself that she was still alive, still capable of delight, still capable of being human beneath the crown. Her indulgence was no longer only comfort. It was resistance, a stand against the silence of approaching death. Beyond her walls, the culture of indulgence grew darker too. Sugar, once rare, now arrived in greater ships, its production tied to distant plantations, its sweetness carrying with it the bitterness of unseen suffering. The Queen may not have felt that chain directly, but history whispers it to us now that the indulgences of her reign were bound to the toil of others across oceans. Junk food is never innocent, even when wrapped in gold leaf. It carries histories of labor, of exploitation, of pain. And yet, for Elizabeth, each candied fruit remained personal, a private act of escape from a world that demanded she be more than human. The politics of her court mirrored these cravings. Factions rose and fell, loyalties shifted, but indulgence was always present at the edges. A gift of sweets could signify favor. A tray of marchpane molded with emblems could flatter. A dish of comfits could carry not only sugar but ambition. Elizabeth knew this, and she wielded it. To accept a sweetmeat was to accept loyalty. To refuse was to signal disfavor. The very junk food of her reign became tools of politics, edible messages passed in candlelit rooms. It is strange, is it not, to imagine the fate of courtiers balanced upon something as small as a candied almond. Yet in the theater of her monarchy, no detail was too small to matter. And as age pressed harder, as her council worried over succession, as whispers of mortality could not be silenced, Elizabeth doubled down on the rituals that comforted her. She appeared in public ever more carefully adorned, her face powdered white, her hair aflame with wigs of red, her gowns heavy with pearls. She was a walking marchpane figure herself, sculpted, decorated, presented to awe. And behind the curtain, in the quiet of her chamber, the sweets remained. They were her link between the performance of eternity and the truth of mortality, her bridge between the myth she had built and the woman who still longed for comfort. If you close your eyes, you might see her in her final winters, the fire burning low, her ladies bustling, the night deep outside. She sits, weary yet unyielding, a tray beside her, bearing candied fruits, wafers, perhaps a small goblet of spiced wine thick with sugar. She takes a piece slowly, lets it melt, and in that silence you sense both triumph and fragility. The queen who defied suitors, who defeated the Armada, who ruled for decades, is still here, but she is also a woman nearing the edge of her story, clinging to sweetness as if it were memory itself. Indulgence had become prayer, had become resistance, had become the softest, most human confession of all, that even queens need comfort, that even crowns cannot quiet craving, that mortality comes for all, and in its shadow, we all reach for something that soothes. For Elizabeth, it was sugar, junk food, in its gilded, Elizabethan form, and through it, she showed us not her weakness but her truth, that power is not the absence of craving but the endurance of it, that humanity is not erased by sovereignty but revealed in the smallest indulgences. By the time the years had gathered heavily upon Elizabeth, her body was no longer the vessel of triumph it once seemed, but she carried herself still with the defiance of a woman unwilling to let the world see the shadows creeping closer. She had outlived rivals, suitors, friends, enemies, and even the young courtiers who once danced attendance upon her. England itself had grown accustomed to her as though she had always been there, eternal, immovable, the virgin queen who never yielded, never changed, never faltered. But inside her chambers, away from the silks and pearls, she was simply a woman who felt the weight of age. And it was in those quiet spaces that her indulgences spoke most clearly. The candied fruits, the marchpane roses, the spiced wines heavy with sugar, had followed her from youth to old age, and now, as the end drew nearer, they seemed less like luxuries and more like memories you could taste, fragments of the past pressed into sweetness, each bite an echo of all that had come before. Her court continued to glow with spectacle, but the glow was thinner now, the faces older, the laughter quieter. And yet the rituals endured. Feasts were still prepared, subtleties still molded, dishes still carried forth to astonish ambassadors and reassure a kingdom. But Elizabeth's part in these spectacles grew smaller. She no longer consumed the grandeur laid before her. Instead, she reached for the small things, the sweetmeats, the wafers, the tiny indulgences that could slip past age's limitations. Her body could not welcome heavy roasts or spiced pies, but her tongue still longed for sugar, still found comfort in the melting of candied peel, still sought the fragile crisp of a wafer dissolving into air. And so, even in the twilight, her junk food cravings remained, unchanged in essence, even as everything else transformed. Think of it, how extraordinary that the very same indulgences that had delighted her as a child now carried her through the final years of her reign. They were not trivial. They were threads of continuity, binding the girl who slipped sugared violets into her mouth to the queen whose teeth had long since darkened with decay. They were her private rebellion, her silent prayer, her refusal to be reduced entirely to image. Even as portraits painted her with eternal youth, even as her courtiers bowed to a myth, she sat in her chamber tasting sweetness, proving to herself that she was still human, still alive, still more than her legend. And yet, mortality could not be escaped. Whispers of her failing health circulated, her thinning frame, her struggles to sleep, the melancholy that seemed to seep deeper with each passing winter. Food itself became a quieter presence in her life, less about sustenance than about memory. She was no longer a queen presiding over abundance, but a woman reaching for fragments of comfort. And still, it was sugar she turned to, sugar that carried her back to the glow of youth, to the triumph of early victories, to the warmth of moments long past. Junk food had become her time machine, her way of tasting eternity in a world that offered her none. Her people, too, felt the twilight approaching. They had lived their entire lives under her, and the thought of her absence was unthinkable. They clung to her image, just as she clung to her sweets, unwilling to let go, unwilling to accept the fragility beneath the glitter. Gingerbread queens still lined the stalls. Children still devoured her likeness, as though eating her image could keep her present forever. Theaters still echoed with allegories of her. Poets still gilded her myth with verse, while outside the palace walls the smell of roasting chestnuts, frying fritters, and sugared wares still filled the streets. It was as though the entire country joined her in indulgence, mirroring her craving, echoing her defiance of mortality with every bite of something sweet, greasy, or frivolous. But in her solitude, indulgence was also sorrow. To taste sugar was to summon ghosts. Every candied violet recalled the girl she once was. Every marchpane rose reminded her of feasts where courtiers long since dead had smiled. Every goblet of sweetened wine carried the laughter of companions she would never hear again. Her junk food became communion with memory, a way of dining with shadows. And as the shadows lengthened, the sweetness grew sharper, almost painful, because each bite reminded her of what could not be regained. Still, she would not let the world see despair. When she appeared in public, she remained dazzling, layered in paint and jewels, her very presence a sugared facade, sweetened against the bitterness of age. She became her own subtlety, sculpted as though from marchpane, decorated and preserved, a living confection designed to awe. And in that artifice, in that performance, she reflected the very nature of indulgence, sweet on the surface, fragile beneath, doomed to dissolve. The queen herself had become the junk food of her reign, consumed by her people's adoration, gilded, celebrated, yet slowly crumbling inside. Imagine her in those final years, sitting in her chamber, refusing to go to bed, restless, pacing, unable to settle. On a table nearby lies a small dish of sugared comfits, gleaming like pearls in the candlelight. She takes one absent-mindedly, rolls it on her tongue. Not for taste alone, but for the comfort of routine. Around her, silence presses in, the silence of courtiers afraid to disturb, the silence of a queen nearing the end yet unwilling to admit it. Each sweet becomes a ward against the darkness, each taste a reminder of the life she has lived, each indulgence a refusal to surrender entirely. The paradox is poignant. She, who once embodied strength, who once ruled with iron will, who once declared she had the heart and stomach of a king, spent her twilight years clinging to the small, fragile comforts of junk food. And in that paradox lies her humanity. For it is not in speeches or victories that we see her most clearly, but in those quiet moments of indulgence, when the myth falls away and only the craving remains. By then, sugar had become almost inseparable from her image. Foreign ambassadors wrote of her fondness, courtiers gossiped about her teeth, satirists whispered cruel jokes, but beneath their words was an unspoken recognition that even the greatest queen could not transcend desire, that even sovereignty bent beneath the weight of craving. Her indulgence was not weakness, it was proof that she was human, and perhaps that is why her people loved her all the more. They knew she bore the same cravings they did, that the same sweetness that comforted her comforted them, that queen and subject alike reached for sugar in the darkness. And so, as Elizabeth moved into the twilight of her reign, her junk food cravings were no longer just personal habits or cultural echoes. They had become symbols of the reign itself. Sweetness that comforted, sweetness that corrupted, sweetness that united, sweetness that masked decay. England itself was sugared, gilded, indulgent, prosperous on the surface, carrying shadows beneath. The queen and her kingdom mirrored each other, each tasting delight while time gnawed quietly away. Close your eyes and imagine her one last time in that twilight chamber. The fire low, the shadows long, her ladies watchful, her body weary, but her spirit still unwilling to yield. On the table before her lies a final plate of sugared fruits. She takes one, places it in her mouth, and for that fleeting instant she is once again the girl who tasted violets, the queen who dazzled courts, the myth who ruled an age. The sweetness lingers, the memory lingers, the myth lingers. And then the night deepens. There comes a moment in every reign when the light begins to falter, when even the strongest image cannot conceal the shadows gathering close. And for Elizabeth, That moment did not arrive in an instant but seeped into her chambers slowly, like dusk deepening against the walls. She who had dazzled ambassadors, who had walked the tightrope of power with unmatched poise, who had carried England upon her shoulders for decades, now found herself alone more often than not, her body weary, her spirit stretched thin by the years. Yet even in this twilight, indulgence clung to her not as luxury, not as spectacle, but as thread, memory, ritual. The candied fruits, the sugared almonds, the comfits that once glittered at banquets, now appeared in smaller, humbler dishes at her side, less to impress and more to soothe. The queen, who had once wielded sweetness as symbol, now reached for it as solace, and in those final years, each bite seemed to carry the weight of an entire life. The palace itself grew quieter. Where once music had echoed through galleries and feasts had spilled their laughter into the night, now there lingered a solemn hush, punctuated only by the whispers of attendants and the occasional cough of the queen herself. Elizabeth no longer staged the grand banquets of her youth. She no longer needed to. Her legend was complete, her image fixed, her people loyal. What remained were smaller gestures, quieter rituals, and food became one of them. Imagine her seated in her chamber, wrapped in heavy gowns though the fire burned low, her fingers tracing the rim of a dish filled with candied orange peel. She lifts one piece slowly, places it on her tongue, and lets it dissolve. It is not merely taste she seeks. It is memory. The memory of earlier days, of triumphs, of youth, of laughter once shared. The sweetness is her time machine, and though her body falters, her spirit clings to the fragments it offers. Her teeth by then were nearly ruined, her smile carefully managed, her mouth a map of years spent surrendering to sugar. But she no longer cared to conceal the consequence. In her final seasons, vanity gave way to endurance, and indulgence ceased to be about appearance at all. It was no longer about being seen with wealth, or displaying prosperity, or even mirroring her kingdom's abundance. It was about survival, finding comfort in something that asked nothing in return, that melted into her without demand. Junk food, in its Elizabethan form, had become her last faithful companion. The sweetness that whispered to her when human voices failed, the fragile anchor she grasped when the world slipped further into shadow. And beyond her walls, England itself reflected the Queen's twilight. The streets of London still bustled, vendors still shouted their pies and fritters. Children still licked sugar sticks with sticky fingers, but even the markets carried the weight of her age. Gingerbread queens were sold not with the vigor of celebration, but with the reverence of nostalgia, as though each bite was already a farewell. Playhouses still echoed with verse, but the allegories of Elizabeth now rang with melancholy. The Virgin Queen invoked more as memory than as living presence. The kingdom was preparing to let go, though no one dared to say it aloud, just as Elizabeth herself clung to sweetness in silence, unwilling to name the end, yet unable to escape it. Her attendants noted how she withdrew from meals, how she picked at dishes, how only the sugared treats seemed to pass her lips with any pleasure. She had grown thin, her appetite waning, yet the craving for sugar endured. Even as her body weakened, that sweet tooth remained stubborn, unyielding, as though it alone carried the power to keep her tethered to life. In those final weeks, when sleep eluded her and melancholy pressed hard upon her, she would sit for hours, restless, refusing to lie down, her body heavy with fatigue but her will resisting surrender. And on a table nearby, always within reach, lay the small comforts, candied fruits, comfits, marchpane pieces, tiny tokens of continuity in a world unraveling. Imagine the scene. The Queen seated on cushions, her eyes hollow but her back still straight, her ladies watching in anxious silence. She reaches for a sugared violet, holds it in her hand as though weighing not only its taste but its meaning, then places it upon her tongue. The sweetness blooms faintly, but what she tastes is more than sugar. She tastes her girlhood, the flicker of stolen delights. She tastes her youth, the triumph of her coronation. She tastes her maturity, the grandeur of her reign. She tastes her twilight, the quiet acceptance of mortality. In that single moment, the entire span of her life seems contained in the dissolving of sugar on her tongue. And then it is gone, leaving only memory, only longing, only silence. Her courtiers feared her decline but dared not press her. She was still their queen, still the symbol of England, still the myth they clung to. Yet within her chamber, she was simply Elizabeth, aging, fragile, clinging to comfort. Junk food had become more than indulgence. It was ritual, sacrament, confession. Each sweet consumed in those final days was like a prayer whispered to herself, a prayer for strength, for continuity, for the endurance of her myth even when her body failed. And perhaps, in some quiet way, she believed that by tasting sweetness she could carry some part of her life into eternity, that the sugar dissolving in her mouth might outlast the silence waiting at the door. When at last her body could no longer resist, when she withdrew fully into her chamber and her attendants hovered like shadows, the indulgences remained by her side. Even in decline, dishes of comfits and candied fruit stood nearby, as though they too were waiting, keeping vigil, loyal until the end. And though no chronicler recorded her final tastes, it is not hard to imagine her reaching one last time for sweetness, one last piece of comfort before surrender. Perhaps it was an almond comfit, small and white, dissolving slowly, carrying her back through memory's corridors. Or perhaps it was candied peel, sharp and sweet, a reminder of both pleasure and pain. Whatever it was, it belonged to her. A final indulgence marking the close of a life lived in craving, in power, in contradiction. When she passed, England mourned not only a queen but an age, and even in their mourning, indulgence remained. Gingerbread queens were baked, sugar effigies molded, comfits scattered at funerals, sweetness woven into farewell. It was as though her craving had seeped into the bones of her people, as though the kingdom itself had inherited her sweet tooth. And in a way, it had. The Elizabethan appetite for indulgence outlived her, carried into centuries beyond, shaping culture, shaping taste, shaping the very way people remembered her. Junk food, in its humble frivolity, had become history, had become legacy, had become the lingering flavor of a queen whose humanity was never erased by her myth. And so, as the candles guttered out and silence claimed her chamber, what remained was sweetness. Not in her mouth, not in her body, but in memory, in culture, in history. The Virgin Queen, the myth eternal, had carried with her into eternity the same craving that marked her first stolen violets. It was never just food. It was never just indulgence. It was life itself, fragile, fleeting, sweet, dissolving on the tongue before you can hold it, leaving behind only longing, only memory, only the echo of taste. When Elizabeth finally left the stage of life, her kingdom did not simply lose a queen. It lost the heartbeat of an age, and yet in that silence her presence lingered in ways both grand and intimate. The chronicles wrote of her speeches, of her victories, of her refusal to bend to marriage or foreign domination. But beneath the gilded rhetoric, another layer remained, softer, sweeter, more fragile. The memory of her cravings, the way she had reached for sugar again and again, as though each grain of sweetness could hold together the vast contradictions of her reign. And after her death, that memory clung to England, not in official decrees or solemn monuments, but in kitchens, in markets, in the quiet ways her people ate. For what she had craved, they had craved. What she had tasted, they had mirrored. And now, in remembering her, they remembered her through sweetness, through indulgence, through the very junk food that had once softened the edges of her solitude. Picture London in the weeks after her passing, the bells tolling, the streets hushed, the city draped in mourning. Yet even as grief pressed upon the people, vendors still sold their sugared wares. Gingerbread queens, long a symbol of her myth, were baked not with celebration but with reverence, their spiced bodies gilded, their faces more solemn than before. Children bit into them quietly, as if consuming a relic, as if by eating her image, they could hold her a little longer. Comfits were scattered at funerals, marchpane sculpted into mournful forms, sugar used to decorate effigies. Sweetness became mourning's language, indulgence turned to elegy. For how else could they remember a queen whose life had been so bound to craving? To sweeten death was to honor her, to mirror her humanity one last time. And in the years that followed, as James of Scotland took the English throne, Elizabeth's memory continued to linger not only in politics but in taste. Tales of her blackened teeth became legend, her sweet tooth whispered of by courtiers and chroniclers alike. Foreign ambassadors had noted it during her life, and now, after her death, it became part of her myth, the virgin queen who ruled like a man, but craved like a child, who painted her face eternal, yet revealed her mortality in every sugared bite. There is something almost tender in this contradiction, something that draws us closer rather than pushing us away. Her speeches made her untouchable. Her cravings made her ours. England itself had changed under her, and food told that story. Sugar, once rare, had poured into the kingdom during her reign, shaping not only her appetite but her people's. After her death, its presence remained, its sweetness now inseparable from the Elizabethan age. Recipes were written, preserved, passed on. Marchpane, comfits, candied fruits, these became not just indulgences but inheritances, traditions that carried her reign forward in flavor. To eat them was to summon her ghost, to taste history on the tongue, to feel, however faintly, the shadow of her presence. In this way, her junk food cravings outlived her, woven into culture itself, part of the way England remembered her. And memory is never neutral. Some remembered her indulgence with affection, as a sign of her humanity. Others mocked it, using her ruined teeth as metaphor for a reign gilded on the surface but rotting beneath. Satirists whispered of her sweet tooth as weakness. Preachers thundered that even queens were undone by gluttony. Yet the truth was simpler, gentler. She was human, and in craving sweetness, she revealed what power cannot erase. The contradictions of her life, strength and fragility, myth and reality, eternity and decay, were mirrored in sugar itself, beautiful and dangerous, comforting and corrosive. In the centuries that followed, her myth only grew, polished by playwrights, sculpted by historians, draped in pearls by artists. But always, beneath the grandeur, there lingered that image. Elizabeth with her sweets, Elizabeth reaching for indulgence, Elizabeth with her sugar-stained smile. Even now, when we conjure her in imagination, we may think first of the portraits, the ruffs, the flame-red wigs, but if we listen closely, another image emerges. A queen in the quiet of her chamber, lifting a candied violet to her lips, savoring its fleeting sweetness in the midst of solitude. That image is as true, perhaps truer, than all the others. And what of her people? They carried her craving forward, embedding it in festivals, in fairs, in traditions that outlasted her. Sugared cakes at weddings, comfits at baptisms, gingerbread queens at markets, these echoes endured. Each one a fragment of Elizabeth's indulgence turned cultural inheritance. Even the language of sweetness shifted, tied more closely to memory, to affection, to nostalgia. To call something Elizabethan was not only to invoke drama or poetry, it was to invoke taste, indulgence, the sharp sweetness that marked an age of contradictions. Think of it, an empire remembered through candy, a reign carried forward in gingerbread and marchpane, a queen immortalized not only in marble and verse, but in junk food. There is something humbling, almost beautiful, in that. The greatest ruler of her age, remembered not only for battles and treaties, but for sugar on her tongue. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, not the myth of perfection, but the echo of craving, the reminder that beneath the crown beat a human heart, one that reached for comfort just as ours do. And so, centuries later, when we unwrap a sweet, when we bite into something frivolous and indulgent, we participate, however faintly, in that same ritual. We mirror her craving, we repeat her gesture, we taste the same paradox of pleasure and consequence. Junk food, in its modern form, is not so distant from Elizabeth's candied violets or her marchpane roses. It carries the same comfort, the same fleeting delight, the same whisper of guilt, the same promise of memory. To eat is to remember, to crave is to connect. And in that connection, Elizabeth lingers still. Her reign ended, her body gone, her myth eternal, but her cravings remain with us. Soft threads woven into the way we eat, the way we remember, the way we tell her story. And if you close your eyes, if you let the sweetness melt on your tongue, perhaps you too can taste her, not the queen draped in pearls, not the myth of eternity, but the woman who reached again and again for sugar in the silence of her chamber. And in that moment, you may realize that history is not only written in speeches and battles, but in crumbs, in cravings, in junk food dissolving softly on the tongue. When we move beyond the silence of Elizabeth's death and into the long corridors of memory, we find that her presence did not vanish but instead grew larger, stretching across centuries, like a figure painted not on canvas, but on the very fabric of time. Kings came and went, dynasties shifted, empires rose and fell, yet the Virgin Queen lingered, her shadow woven into every story England told about itself. And in those stories, it was not only her speeches and her wars that endured, but the smaller, stranger truths that made her human. Her love of sugar, her blackened teeth, her endless reaching for sweets, these details clung like whispers, too intimate to be forgotten, too revealing to be erased. They transformed into myth, becoming part of the way the world understood her. The great queen who carried an empire, and yet who could never resist a candied violet. There is something haunting in that, is there not? That all the grandeur of her reign, all the power she wielded, all the careful performance of eternity, should be remembered alongside the simple, human craving for sweetness. Yet perhaps that is why her legend endures with such force, because it is not only majestic but intimate, not only myth but memory, not only crown but craving. To imagine Elizabeth without her sweets would be to strip her of her humanity. To remember her with them is to keep her close, as if she sits still among us, nibbling at marchpane roses in the quiet of our minds. The centuries that followed painted her in many shades. To some, she was Gloriana, Astrea, the Virgin Queen of golden light. To others, she was a ruler who hardened her body into performance, a woman who denied marriage to wield power on her own terms. And to still others, she was the queen whose vanity powdered her face white, whose teeth crumbled from indulgence, whose body betrayed the paradox of power. Yet in all these versions, sweetness remained. Writers could not resist it. Satirists mocked it. Poets hinted at it. Historians noted it. Her sweet tooth became shorthand for the contradictions of her reign. Power gilded with fragility. Majesty shadowed by decay. And beyond words, the echo of her craving lingered in food itself. England's relationship with sugar deepened long after she was gone, entwined with empire, trade, and exploitation, until sweetness became not only indulgence but destiny. The culture of cakes, puddings, biscuits, and candies that blossomed in later centuries carried within it the ghost of Elizabeth's table, the faint echo of her cravings. The Victorian sweet shop, the modern chocolate bar, the sticky fingers of children clutching candy, all of these, in some distant way, trace their lineage back to the Virgin Queen's fondness for sugared fruits and marchpane roses. She was not the origin, but she was the moment when indulgence ceased to be luxury alone and became identity, woven into the way a nation saw itself. Imagine walking into an English kitchen 2 centuries after her reign. The dishes are different, the recipes evolved, yet sweetness dominates. Sugared cakes on tables, candied fruits at festivals, confections handed to children. None of those children know Elizabeth personally, yet they carry her in their mouths, tasting her legacy with every bite. History is not always preserved in books or monuments. Sometimes it dissolves on the tongue, fleeting and intimate, a legacy not of stone but of flavor. And Elizabeth, in this sense, became immortal not only in words but in sugar, in junk food, in cravings carried forward long after her crown was laid aside. But sweetness, like memory, is never simple. It carries contradiction, comfort laced with danger, pleasure shadowed by consequence. And so too does Elizabeth's legacy. She is remembered as strength and weakness, as majesty and fragility, as crown and craving. Her junk food cravings embody this paradox perfectly. Indulgence that sustained her but also marked her body, comfort that soothed but also decayed, sweetness that mirrored prosperity but concealed suffering. Just as sugar was imported through routes paved with exploitation, her reign too carried shadows beneath its golden myth. To taste sweetness in her name is to taste not only comfort but complexity, not only pleasure but history itself. And perhaps that is why her story resonates still, because we too live in paradox, reaching for indulgences we know are unwise, finding comfort in fleeting pleasures, even as we understand their cost. We, too, eat not only for hunger but for memory, for solace, for defiance. Elizabeth's cravings are ours, centuries apart yet bound by the same human thread. To remember her with her sweets is to see ourselves reflected back, to understand that history is not distant but intimate, not alien but familiar, not only battles and treaties but crumbs and cravings. Picture her one last time, not as the young princess stealing sugared violets, not as the triumphant queen dazzling her court, not as the aged monarch clinging to comfort in solitude, but as all of these at once. A figure who carried her life from childhood to death with sweetness as her companion, who ruled an empire with one hand and reached for comfits with the other, who built a myth of eternity, yet surrendered each night to the fleeting comfort of sugar. That is Elizabeth, majestic, fragile, eternal, human. And it is in that humanity, more than in crowns or speeches, that her legacy lives on. And so, when we speak of junk food in her age, we are not speaking of trivia or curiosity. We are speaking of the essence of history itself, the way craving shapes us, the way indulgence reveals us, the way even queens are bound by hunger. Junk food is not an aside in her story. It is a mirror, showing us the truth beneath the gilding. And Elizabeth, more than any other, teaches us that truth that beneath myth lies craving, beneath eternity lies fragility, beneath history lies humanity. And so we arrive, at last, in the hush after the feast, in the quiet that follows centuries of echo, in the stillness where Elizabeth is no longer a figure on a throne, but a presence that drifts through memory like the faint sweetness of something long dissolved. We have walked with her from childhood to crown, from triumph to twilight, from candied violets stolen in youth, to sugared comfits held in weary hands at the edge of life. And now we stand in the silence that remains after she is gone. And in that silence, what lingers is not the roar of speeches or the clang of battles, but the softer, stranger rhythm of indulgence, the way she reached for sweetness again and again, as if in that fleeting comfort she might hold eternity in her mouth. It is tempting, when history closes, to polish it, to leave only the gleaming surfaces, the portraits, the marble, the golden myths. But here, in this quiet, we remember her differently. We remember her as a queen who ruled an age, yes, but also as a woman whose cravings made her human, whose love of sugar betrayed her body, whose junk food delights became part of her myth. And perhaps that is the truest way to hold her, not as flawless Gloriana, nor as brittle vanity, but as contradiction itself, strength and fragility, majesty and craving, crown and candied violet. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in her chamber, the candles burning low, the air heavy with the scent of wax and faint sugar. She sits before you, her face powdered, her eyes sharp yet shadowed, her hand reaching for a piece of marchpane shaped like a rose. She lifts it slowly, places it on her tongue, and for that instant she is young again. She is triumphant again. She is alive in every age at once. The sweetness dissolves, and she with it, until only memory remains. That is the image that endures, not the grand coronation, not the victory over the Armada, but the quiet indulgence of a queen who, in the end, was as human as those who loved her. And what does this leave us with, here in our own world, centuries later? Perhaps only questions, soft as echoes. What are the sweets you reach for in your solitude? What crumbs of comfort do you cling to when the weight of life presses hard? What indulgence, foolish and fleeting, carries you back to memory, to solace, to yourself? And when you reach for it, do you not feel, faintly, the same paradox Elizabeth felt, that comfort is never free, that sweetness is always shadowed by consequence, that indulgence is both salvation and surrender? In this way, Elizabeth is not gone. She lingers in every bite of junk food, in every craving that defies reason, in every human gesture that seeks comfort over discipline. She lingers in the gingerbread queens, still baked at fairs, in the candied fruits at festivals, in the sugared cakes that mark celebration and grief alike. She lingers in us, not in marble or crown, but in craving, in indulgence, in the universal truth that to live is to hunger, and to hunger is to seek comfort, even when comfort dissolves too quickly to hold. Perhaps that is the final lesson of her reign, not that power endures, not that myth can mask decay, but that humanity is never erased by crown or history. Even the greatest queen is undone by craving, and in that undoing, she becomes closer, more ours, more eternal in her fragility than in her grandeur. Her speeches fade, her portraits crack, her empire long since dissolved, but the taste of sweetness remains. carried forward in memory, in culture, in every sugared indulgence that binds us to the past. And so we end where we began, with sweetness melting on the tongue, with junk food that is not trivial but profound, with indulgence that is not weakness but confession. Elizabeth's life was theater, but her cravings were truth. And when we remember her now, let us remember not only the crown but the candied violet, not only the myth but the mouth that sought sweetness, not only the queen but the woman who, in the quiet of her chamber, reached again and again for comfort, as we all do. Good night, my friend. May you carry with you the softness of this story, the sweetness of its memory, the paradox of its truth. And as you drift into sleep, ask yourself, what sweetness do you hold? What indulgence do you reach for? What comfort dissolves on your tongue even as it vanishes? And perhaps, in that question, you will find Elizabeth still beside you, whispering across centuries, reminding you that to crave is to live, to indulge is to confess, and to taste sweetness is to touch eternity, if only for a moment.